You Miss Mercer?
I am. You Jethro?
The man you came to meet is gone.
What happened to him? I'm not going back east.
Then you'd better be ready to work.
A Boston woman crossed 2,000 miles of wilderness alone, not for love, but for freedom. Follow along so you don't miss what happens next. The stagecoach pulled in 20 minutes late. Evie Mercer stepped down onto the frozen platform and immediately felt the cold punch through her traveling gown like a fist. Wyoming territory in late autumn wasn't anything like the travel pamphlets suggested. The wind came off the mountains sideways, sharp and personal, and it didn't care one bit that she'd spent the last 11 days crossing half a continent to get here. She straightened her spine anyway. The depot at Timberline was little more than a timber shed and a rusted iron bell post. No welcome banner. No flowers. No Jethro Vanacek waiting with a shy smile in a hired buggy, the way she'd half imagined during the long, sleepless nights on the train. Just a platform dusted with frost crystals, a torn postal notice tacked to the shed wall, and 4 men standing in a loose row near the hitching posts. 4 very large men. They hadn't come forward yet. They just stood there, watching her with the particular stillness of people who spend most of their lives outdoors, where patience isn't a virtue so much as a survival skill. Their breath came out in pale clouds. Their coats were thick and dark, worn soft at the elbows. Each one had a rifle slung or holstered, casual as a carpenter carries a hammer. Evie picked up her single trunk, herself before the coachman could drop it. She dragged it 2 steps forward and stopped in front of them. Up close, they were even bigger. She was not a small woman, but these men made her feel like she'd wandered into a stand of old-growth timber and was looking straight up. The tallest one spoke first, Miss Mercer. His voice was low and even. Not unkind, but not warm either. Just honest. The tone of a man who'd made a decision about what he was going to say and wasn't going to dress it up. I'm Thurston Vanacek. These are my brothers Bram, Keir, and Rowan. He gestured down the line. Bram had a scar cutting through his left jaw and the watchful eyes of someone who'd learned to size up threats fast. Keir was the largest of the 4, broad through the shoulders like a barn door, and he looked at her with a kind of careful, assessing quiet. Rowan was the youngest, dark-haired, with ink stains on his right fingers that she noticed because she'd grown up around men who carried ledgers, and ink stains on a frontiersman's hand meant something different than they did in Boston. "It's good to meet you," she said. She meant it to sound composed. She thought it came close. Thurston nodded once, then the steadiness in his expression shifted, just slightly. Something heavier moved in behind it. "There's something I need to tell you before we go any further," he said. "Jethro is gone." Evie went very still. "He died 10 days ago," Thurston continued. "Mine collapsed on the upper ridge. We pulled him out, but it was already too late." He held her gaze the whole time he spoke. She appreciated that. Bad news delivered to a woman's shoes was an insult wrapped in false sympathy. "I'm sorry. He talked about your letters. He was looking forward to your arrival." The wind pressed against her back. The stagecoach horses shifted and stamped behind her. She had crossed 2,000 miles for a man she'd never met in person, only corresponded with for 4 months. She'd been honest with herself about what that arrangement was. A practical agreement between 2 people who needed something the other could provide. She wasn't in love with Jethro Vanacek. She'd barely known him. But she had believed in the possibility he represented. And now that possibility was buried under a Wyoming mountain. And 4 strangers were standing in front of her, waiting to see what she'd do. Thurston reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "There's enough in there for your return fare to Cheyenne and train passage east from there. You'd be back in Boston inside of 2 weeks." Evie looked at the envelope. She thought about Boston. She thought about the parlor of Senator Aldrich Holbrook, where she'd stood up in front of 14 men and told them what she'd seen one of their colleagues do to a 16-year-old maid named Clara. She thought about the silence that followed, and then the noise, and then how quickly a woman's reputation could be dismantled in a city where powerful men protected one another with the quiet efficiency of a machine. She thought about her mother's face at the door of their brownstone, 6 months later, when the last of Evie's social invitations had stopped coming. And she'd said, "You brought this on yourself, Genevieve." And she'd meant it, as comfort. She looked back up at Thurston Vanasek. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I'm not taking it." Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, more like reevaluation. She reached into her traveling bag, the one she'd kept clutched on her lap for 11 days, on trains and coaches, precisely because it held the things that mattered. She drew out a folded document, creased soft from handling, and held it out to him. "I have a contract. 6-month trial term signed by Jethro Vanasek in September of this year, co-witnessed by the Territorial Land Office in Laramie. Household management and labor in exchange for room board and a fair wage at term's end." Thurston took the document. He unfolded it with one large, scarred hand and read it carefully. Not skimming, actually reading. She noted that. Bram made a sound beside him, something skeptical. His arms were crossed, and he was watching her the way a man watches a fence post he suspects might be rotten. Rowan, on the other hand, had leaned forward slightly to read the document over Thurston's shoulder, and there was something in his expression that might have been the early stages of being impressed. Keir said nothing. He was looking at her hands. Evie knew what he saw. Boston hands. Hands that had poured tea and turned pages, and once, memorably, attempted to arrange flowers for a dinner party that ended in her social destruction. Hands with no calluses, no useful scars. She curled them around the strap of her bag and kept her chin level. Thurston refolded the contract and handed it back. "The contract was made with Jethro. Jethro is dead." "The contract was made with the Vanasek homestead," Evie said. "That still exists. And so do 4 of you, which means the labor requirements are, if anything, greater than they were when Jethro signed this." She paused. "I did not cross 2,000 miles for charity. I came to earn my keep with my own 2 hands." Silence. The wind moved through the gap between the shed and the hitching rail and made a low, tuneless sound. Thurston looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. She'd stopped looking away from men in positions of authority approximately 9 months ago, and she hadn't yet found a reason to start again. Finally, he folded the document back to her. "We leave in 10 minutes, he said. "The pass gets treacherous after dark." He turned and walked back toward the horses. Bram followed, though he shot her one last look over his shoulder that communicated roughly 12 different reservations without a single word. Rowan caught her eye as he passed. "Welcome to Wyoming, Miss Mercer," he said quietly. Something in his voice was genuine enough to surprise her. Keir walked to her trunk. He lifted it like it weighed nothing, settled it onto the pack horse's rigging, and secured it with 2 quick, practiced knots. Then he moved to help her up. She put her hand in his. His palm was enormous, rough as cured leather, warm in a way that didn't quite make sense given the temperature. Her own hand looked very small inside it, and very pale, and very clearly unacquainted with hard physical labor. She climbed up onto the saddle and gathered the reins. The mountains stood ahead of them, massive and indifferent, their peaks already swallowed in gray cloud. The trail north was frozen solid and barely wide enough for a horse. She'd made her choice when she'd bought the train ticket in Boston. She'd made it again when she'd declined the return fare 30 seconds ago. There wasn't a third version of this decision available to her. Evie Mercer squared her shoulders, pressed her heels gently to the horse's flanks, and rode toward Wind River Range. The cabin sat at the end of a mile-long trail that climbed steadily through black pine and frozen granite. Evie smelled wood smoke before she saw it. Then the trees opened up, and there it was, a low, broad structure of notched logs, the chinking gray with old mortar, the roof weighted with sod and a dusting of early snow. A stone chimney rose from the east end, A barn sat 30 yards behind it, and beyond that, the mountain just kept going up. It wasn't pretty. It was solid, though. She could see that immediately. The logs were tight, and the roof didn't sag, and whoever had built this thing had built it to last through whatever Wyoming chose to throw at it. That was something. Inside was warmer than she expected, though not by a wide margin. A stone fireplace dominated the main room. There was a plank table, 4 chairs, and a fifth that was slightly shorter than the others, a cast-iron stove, a shelf of tin provisions, and a scatter of tools and harness that occupied every flat surface with democratic impartiality. Rowan moved 2 saddlebags off a chair so she could sit. Keir set her trunk down in the narrow room off the main hall, her room, apparently without being asked. Thurston hung his coat and rifle and began building up the fire without fanfare. Bram stood near the door with his arms still crossed and made no move to do anything welcoming at all. Evie didn't sit. She looked around the room for approximately 30 seconds, cataloging what was there and what wasn't. Then she found the flour sack, the lard tin, and the salt box, and she started on biscuits. She would later identify this as her first mistake. The biscuits burned. Not a little. They went in pale and came out the color of old charcoal. And when Thurston lifted the Dutch oven lid and looked inside, he did it with the particular expression of a man who has decided to say nothing, because nothing good was available. Bram said something. She didn't catch all of it. She caught enough. Soft hands, he said to Keir, not quite under his breath. Can't even manage a Dutch oven. Evie looked at the burned biscuits. She looked at her hands. Then she put the Dutch oven to the side, picked up the small axe that was leaning against the wall by the back door, and went outside to the woodpile. The cold hit her like a wall. Her gown was completely wrong for this. She knew that. She started splitting kindling anyway. The axe was heavier than it looked, and the first 3 swings went crooked. The 4th one connected properly, and the birch log split clean. She stacked it and went again. Her palms stung. The cold made everything worse. She kept going. She lost track of how many she split, long enough that her shoulders ached in a new and specific way, long enough that her fingers went from stinging to numb, and then back to stinging again. She didn't go inside. She was going to split enough kindling to last 2 days, if it killed her. At some point, she became aware that someone was standing near the corner of the cabin watching her. She didn't look up. Bram didn't say anything either. He stood there for a while, watching her work, and then he went back inside. She heard the door. When she finally came in and stacked the kindling by the hearth, her palms were blistered on both hands. She didn't make a show of it. She washed them in the basin, dried them, and started on supper with what she had left to work with, which was salt pork and the dried beans she found in the bottom of the provisions shelf. The salt pork she managed fine. The beans she'd soaked wrong, and they came out mealy, but nothing burned this time, and she counted that as progress. Nobody said grace at this table. Nobody said much of anything. Forks moved. Tin cups were refilled. The fire crackled. Then Rowan said, conversationally, "The elevation changes how dry goods hydrate. You'd need to soak the beans overnight up here, not just a few hours. The water boils at a lower temperature than it does at sea level." Evie looked at him. "I'd have mentioned it earlier," he added, "but I didn't know you were making beans." "I'll remember that," she said. Bram looked at his plate and said nothing, but he finished everything on it. That first night, Evie lay in her narrow room and listened to the wind work its way around the cabin walls and thought about the gap between what she'd imagined this life would be and what it actually was. She'd known it would be hard. She hadn't quite understood what that meant in physical terms until her hands started throbbing in the dark, and the cold pressed in through the log wall beside her cot. Despite the extra blanket she'd pulled over her coat, she shifted. She stared at the ceiling. She heard Keir moving around before first light. By the time she came out, he'd already left something by the hearth in her room. She nearly tripped on it in the dark. A bundle of birch logs, already split small, the way you'd split them for a lady's hearth, not the heavy rounds he'd stack for the main fireplace. She stood there in the cold for a moment, looking at them. She thought, nobody told him to do that. She built the fire up and went to help with breakfast. The days established their shape quickly, whether she was ready for them or not. Mornings were brutal. The water in the basin iced over every night and had to be broken before anything could be washed. The stove needed to be coaxed, not just lit. There was a particular draft issue with the left side of the firebox that she learned about by trial, and it was a loud and smoky lesson. She burned 2 more batches of biscuits before she figured out the Dutch oven sat better with a trivet under the left corner. Something Keir demonstrated by silently putting the trivet in place the 3rd morning while she stood there, holding the lid and trying not to swear. She kept a mental ledger of what she learned every day. It was the only way she knew how to approach things she didn't yet understand. Rowan noticed. One afternoon, while she was trying to identify a dried root she'd found in the provisioning room, he pulled a battered botanical reference from the shelf and set it open next to her on the table. Then he sat down across from her and started reading, not making a thing of it, just making himself available if she had questions. She had several. They talked for an hour about high-altitude plant medicine, which plants you could eat in a survival situation, and which ones would put you on the ground faster than a bullet, which roots had drawing properties for wounds, and which ones reduced fever. It was the most genuinely useful conversation she'd had since leaving Boston. "Why do you know all of this?" she asked him. "Because Jethro didn't," he said.
Someone had to.
He said it without weight, just a fact. But she heard what was under it: 4 brothers in a mountain cabin, one of them determined to make sure they all knew enough to stay alive. The 4th day, she slipped. She'd gone out early to break the ice on the water barrel, and the creek bank was slicker than she'd estimated. Her feet went out from under her completely, and she went down hard on her hip, and one palm sliding halfway to the water line before her free hand caught a tree root. She lay there for a moment, just breathing. The sky above the tree line was that particular shade of cold weather blue that had no warmth in it at all. The creek moved quietly below her, unconcerned. Her hip was going to bruise badly. Her palm was bleeding where the root had torn it open. She did not cry. She pulled herself back up the bank by the root, hand over hand, and stood up and went back to the cabin to wash her hand and get the water pail another way. Later that day, she found Thurston in the small room off the main hall that served as a workshop. He had an iron bar in the fire and a hammer in his hand, and he was working on something at the small anvil mounted to the work table. The metal rang sharp in the closed space. She watched him work for a moment. He moved with a precision that was almost restful, no wasted motion, no second-guessing. Just a clear sense of what the material needed and how to give it that. He brought the shaped iron to the door of her room and fitted it into place with 4 iron pins, working each one in with deliberate taps. It was a sliding latch, heavy wide, seated flush to the doorframe. It operated entirely from the inside. She understood what it was before he explained it. But he explained it anyway, because some things needed to be said plainly. He turned to face her. His voice was the same even register it always was, but there was something in it she hadn't heard before. An emphasis, careful and real. "Under this roof," he said, "a woman is no man's servant. That latch only opens from the inside whenever she wills it." Evie looked at the latch. She reached out and slid it closed, then open, then closed again. "Nobody decides what happens in that room except you," Thurston said. "Not me. Not my brothers, not any man who rides through this valley. That's not a courtesy. That's a rule." She looked back at him. She'd met men who spoke about women's dignity. Most of them did it at podiums, in rooms where women weren't allowed to vote on what was being decided about them. This man had made a piece of iron and put it on her door with his own hands at the end of a 14-hour day, and he'd said what it meant without dressing it up or expecting gratitude for it. "Thank you," she said. "It's a reasonable thing." he said. Shouldn't require thanks. He picked up his tools and went back to the workshop. Evie stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment. Then she went back to the stove to figure out supper. She burned the bottom of the gravy that night. But only the bottom. Progress, she thought. She was going to be all right here. The room that had been Jethro's sat at the far end of the cabin, past Rowan's bookshelves, and the narrow corridor that smelled permanently of tallow and wood smoke. Nobody had touched it since his death. That much was clear from the dust. Evie asked Thurston on her 6th day if she could clean it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said yes, and didn't say anything else, and that was that. She started at the window ledge and worked inward. There wasn't much to sort through a young man's effects in a frontier cabin, amounted to less than most people imagined. A spare coat on a peg, a tin of arrowheads he'd apparently been collecting, 2 letters in a tobacco box, both from their mother, dated 1877, tied with a piece of cord. A Bible with a cracked spine and several pages underlined in pencil, but nothing written in the margins. She set everything aside carefully. These were Thurston's things to decide about. Not hers. She was on her knees, scrubbing the far corner of the floor when she felt it. She'd been working her way across the pine boards with a stiff brush and a bucket of lye water, and the boards had all felt solid, and even beneath her until she reached the corner farthest from the door, and one plank moved. Not much. Just a faint give under the heel of her hand, a 1/4 inch of flex that the rest of the floor didn't have. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. She pressed it again. Same give. She worked her fingernails into the join between planks, and the board lifted easily. Someone had cut the nails. Deliberately. It came up clean. The lockbox underneath was small, made of tin, with a hinged lid, painted black. Not locked. She opened it. There was money at the bottom, not much, $12 in coin, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a promissory note for the purchase of a surveying tool. Nothing unusual, but on top of those, sitting right at the surface like Jethro had put it there last, was a journal. Leather covered the pages thick and water-stained at the edges, but intact. Evie sat down on the cold floor, pulled the journal onto her lap, and started reading. The first 20 pages were ordinary enough. Weather records, or notations, daily accounts of work on the claims. Jethro's handwriting was larger than she'd expected, looping and a little unsteady. Someone who'd taught himself to write, rather than learning young. He'd been thorough, though. Dates, quantities, names of other miners he'd traded words with at the Ridge Camp. Then, about a third of the way in, the entries changed. The date at the top was second, 1881, 2 months before his death. Malachi Drake's man came to the claim again today, 3rd time in 6 weeks. He wasn't asking. He was telling, says the company holds a lien on the north face, going back to the original survey filing. I've seen the original survey filing. There's no such lien. The next entry was September 9th. Talked to Harlan at the assay office. He says 3 other independent operations on the range have been served with the same kind of paper. Olin Marsh settled and sold out. Boyd Ferris didn't settle, and his barn burned flat last month. Nobody's calling it arson, but nobody's not calling it arson either. Evie read faster. October 14th, I went up to the high cut to check the support structure after the last blast. The main crossbeam on the lower 8 has been worked, not by settling, by a pry bar. I can see the tool marks. Someone went at the joint with iron and then let the natural weight of the mountain do the rest. October 19th, confirmed. Showed Thurston. He wanted to go straight to Drake's office in Stonewater, and I told him to wait. We need more than what I can see with my eyes. We need paper. October 28th, the last entry before a gap, Drake's man came with the debt note today. $500 against the property. Interest compounding weekly, with a 20-day cure period. The note cites a mortgage instrument I have never signed. The figures are wrong and the clauses are predatory, but I don't know enough about contract law to say exactly how. I need someone who does. I'm going back up the high cut tomorrow to make a proper survey of the damage and get drawings. There were no more entries after that date. Evie sat very still on the cold floor and held the journal in both hands and looked at the date of the last entry. October 28th, the mine collapse, had been November 2nd. She put the journal back in the lockbox, closed the lid, and went to find Thurston. She found all four of them in the main room, Thurston at the table, reviewing what appeared to be survey maps. Bram cleaning a rifle by the fire, Keir mending a harness at the far wall, and Rowan reading. She came in, put the lockbox on the table in front of Thurston, and lifted the lid. I found this under the floor in Jethro's room, she said. The journal is what matters. I'll let you read it, but I need to tell you what's in it first, because there's something else coming. They were all looking at her. She told them, plainly, quickly, without editorializing. The tool marks on the support beam. Drake's name in Jethro's own handwriting. The three other operations served with similar notes. The fact that Jethro had suspected all of it and gone back to gather evidence 5 days before he died. When she finished, no one spoke for a moment. Bram set the rifle down. The easy looseness that usually occupied his posture was completely gone. Thurston picked up the journal and started reading from the beginning. He read without expression, but his jaw tightened on the October 14th entry in a way she could see clearly from across the table. Then the sound of horses came from outside. Keir was at the window before anyone else moved, his enormous frame nearly blocking the light. 2 riders, he said. Don't know the horses. Bram had his rifle back in his hands before the knock landed on the door. Thurston closed the journal, stood, and answered it. 2 men stood on the porch. Both wore town coats rather than working gear. One held a sealed document. He looked at Thurston and said, Mr. Vanasek, I'm serving this on behalf of the Territorial Investment Bank of Stonewater. You have 20 days to respond. He held out the document. Thurston took it. Both men left without another word. Thurston brought it to the table and laid it open. It was a demand note. $500 principal, interest compounding at a rate of 12% weekly from the date of issue, secured against the Vanasek property claim in its entirety. The cure period was 20 days. The consequence of default was immediate transfer of title. Evie pulled the document toward herself and read it from the top. Then she read it again, slowly, the second time with her finger tracking each clause. Who taught you contracts? Rowan asked quietly. He was watching her face. Nobody, she said. I learned from reading them. My father collected debts. I read everything in his office from the time I was old enough to reach the shelf. She turned to page 2. This note cites a mortgage instrument executed in March 1879. Did Jethro ever take out a mortgage? Thurston said. No. Is there a signed copy of anything from that date in your files? There's nothing from that date. She pointed at the third clause. Then this instrument is fraudulent. This is a lien claimed against a debt that does not exist. She moved to the next clause, and this interest rate is illegal under current territorial lending statutes. 12% compounding weekly comes to over 500% annually. The statute caps at 15% annually. She turned to the back page. This notary seal is from Laramie County. This property is in Fremont County. Different jurisdiction. This note has no legal standing under territorial code. Bram had come to stand at the edge of the table. He was looking at the document, then at her, then back at the document. You know all of that, he said, flat, like a statement that was still trying to decide if it was a question. I know enough of it, she said, enough to know we can contest it. But to contest it, we need leverage, and leverage means assets. She looked at Thurston. What's up on that high cut? Thurston looked at his brothers. Something passed between the four of them. Without words, some kind of rapid, silent accounting built from 33 years of shared history. Quartz vein, Thurston said. Raw ore. We broke into it 6 weeks ago, right? He stopped, started again. Right before Jethro died. We haven't been back up since. What's the value? If the vein runs deep, Keir said, from the wall quietly, enough to clear that note. Maybe more. Evie looked at the demand note. Then she looked at the journal on the table, still open to October 28th. Then here's what I see, she said. Drake sawed those support beams to kill the mine and scare you off the claim. When that didn't fully work, he manufactured a fraudulent debt instrument to take the property legally. We have 20 days before that note matures. She picked up the journal. We have Jethro's documentation of what he found. We have my analysis of why this note is void. What we don't have yet is enough cash or ore to discharge the principal, which is what we'd need to shut Drake down completely, because a man like this doesn't walk away from a legal challenge unless he has no financial angle left to work. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the wind had picked up. So we go back to the high cut, Rowan said. He wasn't asking. We go back to the high cut, Evie confirmed. Bram looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read everything in his expression. There was still resistance in it, something hard and untrusting. But there was something else now, too, some grudging admission that she'd earned by knowing what she knew and saying it plainly. You'd come up there with us, he said. I'd carry the processing records and run the sluice, she said. That's labor, and labor is what I came here to do. Nobody argued with that. Thurston picked up the demand note, folded it, and set it in the lockbox next to Jethro's journal. He closed the lid. We leave at first light, he said, before the weather turns. They left before sunrise. The trail to the high cut climbed nearly 2,000 feet in 4 miles, and the first hour was done in near darkness, the horses picking their way up the switchbacks by memory and instinct, while the sky above the ridgeline went from black to gray to the particular pale amber of a Wyoming dawn with no warmth in it. Evie rode third in the line between Rowan and Keir. She hadn't complained about the hour. She hadn't complained about the cold, which was deeper up here than it was at the cabin, with a wind that came off the snowfields above tree line and found every gap in your clothing with systematic efficiency. She'd packed the record book and 2 sharpened pencils in her coat's inner pocket, close to her body, so the cold wouldn't make the paper brittle. She was here to work. She intended to make that obvious. The mining camp at Granite Ridge was a timber platform built into the south face of a granite shelf, wide enough for the ore cart, the sluice box, and a small supply tent staked to iron pins driven into the rock. Below the platform, a natural channel in the granite ran with meltwater not much at this time of year, barely a trickle, but enough for sluicing if you were careful about it. Thurston and Keir went straight to the adit entrance. Bram took the high ground above camp without being asked, settling into a natural notch in the rock with his Winchester, and a sight line in all 3 directions that mattered. Rowan began setting up the supply tent and got the small camp stove lit with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done it in worse conditions. Evie looked at the sluice box and the system of channels feeding it, and then she asked Rowan to explain the processing sequence while he worked. He did, clearly and without condescension. Raw ore came out of the adit in the cart, went to the crushing plate, where Keir would break the larger pieces, then moved to the sluices, where the water current separated the heavy quartz from the lighter gangue. The sluices' riffles, the raised strips of wood on the box's floor, caught the dense material and held it while the waste washed over. Periodic cleanup pulled the concentrated ore from the riffles and moved it to the collection pans. The riffles need checking every 2 hours, Rowan said. They can clog with fine clay if the ore's been sitting wet. A clogged riffle misses material. How do I know when they're clogged? The water stops sheeting evenly across the box. You'll see pooling on the upstream side of a riffle instead of flowing over it. She wrote that down. She wrote a lot down that first morning. Ore weight per cart load, average processing time per load, estimated concentration ratio, from visual inspection of the cleanup pans. She set up a running yield log with date, time, cart number, and estimated value per pan. By mid-morning, she'd established a system that let her call the day's running total at any point without stopping work to recalculate. Thurston noticed. He came out of the 80 for a water break around the third hour and looked at her log over her shoulder. "You've got load 12 noted at roughly 4 ounces concentrated," he said. "That's my estimate," Rowan said. "The assay rate on this vein runs around half an ounce per cart load on average, but load 12 looked denser than average. I noted it as 4 because the cleanup pan was heavier and the color was stronger. I could be wrong by a quarter ounce either way." Thurston looked at the pan she'd set aside, then at her. "You're not wrong," he said. He went back into the adit. The fourth hour was when it happened with Bram. She'd moved to the far edge of the processing platform to get better light on the cleanup pan she was weighing, stepping out onto the scree apron below the timber platform, where the granite broke up into loose angular fragments, descending toward the cliff edge. She hadn't thought much about it. The rock looked stable. It wasn't. The scree moved under her left foot all at once, a sudden lateral shift of about 18 inches, and she went with it. She dropped the pan, threw her weight backward, and got absolutely nowhere. The loose rock kept moving, carrying her sideways and down toward the drop. She had exactly enough time to understand she wasn't going to stop herself. Then a hand closed around her upper arm hard and fast, and she stopped. Bram had come off his perch and crossed 20 yards of broken rock in about 4 seconds. His grip on her arm was iron. His other hand caught the back of her coat and hauled her bodily up the scree slope and back onto solid granite. And the whole thing took less time than it would have taken her to scream. They ended up face to face on the platform edge, close enough that she could see the individual scars on his jaw, the pale, ragged one that cut through his beard, and the older, flatter one beneath his left eye. His breathing was controlled but barely. His chest was moving. Her breath was gone entirely. For a moment, neither of them moved. His eyes were dark and very direct, and there was something in them that had nothing to do with the irritable, watchful distance he'd maintained for the past week. Something stripped back, immediate. The cold air moved between them, and their breath mixed in the same pale cloud, and the world was very quiet. Then Bram released her arm. He stepped back. He looked down at the scree, then at her. "Don't go past the platform edge," he said. His voice came out rougher than usual. "The rock face sheds loose material this time of year. The whole apron is unstable." "I'll remember that," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and went back to his post without another word. She stood there for a beat, then picked up the pan she'd dropped it, had landed on the platform, not gone over, small mercy, and went back to work. At noon, Rowan brewed coffee on the camp stove and produced dried venison and hardtack from the supply pack. They ate without ceremony, standing or sitting on whatever piece of rock was convenient. The wind had dropped and the sun was out properly for the first time in days, and from the ridge you could see 100 miles of valley laid out below in shades of brown and gray, and the faint steel blue of the frozen river. Rowan had his botanical reference with him, despite everything, tucked in his coat pocket. During the break, he pulled it out and read for exactly 12 minutes by Evie's count, then put it away. He'd also brought a slim volume of Whitman that he balanced on his knee while he drank his coffee. "You carry that everywhere?" she asked, nodding at the Whitman. "Keir gave it to me when I turned 18, he said. He couldn't afford the particular edition I'd wanted, so he found a second-hand copy and rebound it himself. Better than the original." He turned it over in his hand. "Reading reminds me, there are other kinds of minds in the world. Prevents insularity." "We're fairly insular up here," she observed. "Which is exactly why," he said. Keir, for his part, had spent the lunch break at the corner of the platform with a short piece of pine and his belt knife. His hands moved in long, steady passes, the knife taking thin curls off the wood with a control that seemed almost casual given the size of his hands. At the end of the break, he stood up, walked to Evie, and held out what he'd made. A spoon, pine, smooth-handled, the bowl shaped with real care. "The tin spoon you've been using at camp has a rough edge," he said. It was one of the more complete sentences she'd heard from him. "That one will serve you better." She took it, ran her thumb across the bowl. He'd sanded it smooth with something. She didn't know what, but there wasn't a rough edge anywhere on it. "Thank you, Kier," she said. He nodded and went back into the adit. The real breakthrough came at the 14th cart. She heard it. Before she saw it, a change in the sound coming from inside the adit. The ring of the pickaxe hitting something that resonated differently than the surrounding granite. Then Thurston's voice, short and sharp, calling for Kier, and then silence, and then both of them came out of the adit entrance with a piece of ore in Thurston's hands, the size of a man's skull, white and heavy, and shot through with color. Evie had been learning to read ore samples for 8 days. She didn't know everything, but she knew what high-grade quartz looked like in good light, and this was it. Thurston set it on the scale. He and Evie looked at the reading together. She wrote it down. They went through the cart that followed, and the one after that, and she kept running the numbers in the margin of her record book while the afternoon light shifted west. By the time the light got too thin to keep working, she had the total. 16 carts from the new face, she said. She turned the record book so Thurston could see. "Best estimate, accounting for variance in my concentration readings, somewhere between $270 and $320 in refined value at current assay rates." Thurston looked at the number. "Enough to discharge Drake's principal," he said. "With room to spare," she said. "Enough to make the discharge public, in front of witnesses, in a way that removes his financial claim completely." Bram had come down from the high ground for the pack-out. He heard that. He looked at the record book, then at Evie. He didn't say anything, but he stopped looking at her like she was a problem he hadn't figured out how to solve yet. That was enough. They loaded the ore into the secured pack boxes as the last of the daylight left the ridge, working fast and quiet. Thurston padlocked the boxes. Bram and Kier lashed them to the 2 strongest horses. Evie rolled the record book in oilcloth and tucked it inside her coat. They made camp on the platform rather than attempting the trail in the dark. Rowan made a spare supper on the camp stove. The temperature dropped fast once the sun was gone, and they pulled the supply tent into a configuration that sheltered 2 sides of the sleeping area, the stove running low but steady in the corner. Evie sat with her back against the supply packs and wrote up the day's full record by lantern light, while the brothers settled around the stove. The wind had come back, and it moved through the rock above camp in long, searching gusts. Rowan was reading. Kier was already asleep. His enormous frame curled toward the stove with an economy that didn't seem like it should work, but evidently did. Bram was sharpening his knife on a whetstone with slow, methodical strokes. Thurston sat with the survey map spread across his knees, marking something on it with a stub pencil. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the wind and the stove and the scrape of the whetstone. Then Thurston said, without looking up, "Good work today, Evie." It was the first time any of them had used her name without the miss in front of it. She looked up from the record book. "It's just numbers," she said. "No," Thurston said. He did look up then. "Numbers by themselves are just weight. You turned them into a plan. That's different." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at her record book. Outside, the wind built toward something. She woke to the smell of smoke. Not the clean wood smoke of the camp stove, but something broader and wrong, with an acrid quality underneath it. She sat up in the cold, and the smell was already in the tent. Outside the tent wall, the darkness was not complete. She was moving before she fully understood why. She pushed out through the tent flap, and the wind hit her, and she saw at the horse barn at the lower end of the camp platform was burning, not just catching. Fully ablaze, the entire roof already involved, the interior lit from within so that the gaps between the boards showed orange and white. The horses were screaming. Bram was already at the barn. He'd gotten the door open somehow and was bringing the horses out one at a time, each one wild-eyed and plunging, and he was holding them by sheer force of hand and voice, walking them away from the fire to the tie line at the far end of the platform. Kier appeared from the direction of the supply tent and went straight to Bram without being told, taking two horses at once, muscling them away from the light and the heat with his body, and his voice low and steady. Thurston was at her side. "Get back from the barn," he said. "There's powder in there for the bore work." She got back. They all got back. The powder went with a flat, heavy crack that shook the rock platform and sent a column of sparks straight up into the black sky. And then the fire went on burning, just bigger. Evie watched it. She was counting horses at the tie line. Rowan was there now, working them, running a quiet accounting of who was present and who wasn't. 6 horses out, 6 horses in. No losses. She looked back at the barn, then she looked at the ground around it. The snow in front of the barn doors had been disturbed. Not by horse hooves and not by feet going toward the fire. By feet going away from it. Several sets. She crouched down and looked closer. There were boot prints going back around the south side of the platform, toward the rock face, toward the trail. "Thurston," she said. He came. She showed him the prints without commenting on them. He studied them, then straightened. "How many?" she asked. "3, he said. "Maybe 4. He looked toward the rock face where the prints disappeared. They used the back trail. Kier had come up beside them. He was looking at the embers at the mouth of the barn, where the door frame had burned down to the base. He went in close to the heat, shielding his face with one arm, and crouched. He stayed there for a moment. Then he reached into the edge of the ash pile with a gloved hand. He stood up and turned around. In his hand was a silver belt buckle. The shape of it was irregular, stamped with an elk head. The silver darkened with heat but intact. Thurston went absolutely still. Rowan made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Evie didn't know what she was looking at, but she understood from all 3 of their faces that the buckle meant something very specific and very terrible. "That's Jethro's," Bram said. He'd come from the tie line. His voice was flat, in a way that had nothing to do with calm. "He wore that every day I ever knew him." Nobody said anything for a moment. The fire crackled and settled. A length of burning timber fell inside the barn and sent a shower of sparks into the dark. Kier was still holding the buckle. He turned it over in his hand once carefully. The elk head caught the firelight. "He could have lost it in the mine," Rowan said quietly. "Months ago." "Or someone put it here," Evie said. Bram looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means someone wanted you to find it here." She kept her voice even. "Enkindling at the site of an arson. Right where it would make you wonder whether Jethro had something to do with it." Bram's jaw tightened. "He was my brother." "I know," she said. "I'm not saying he did. I'm saying someone wants you to wonder if he did. Those are different things. And right now, in the middle of the night with the barn burned down and the ore still on the horses, you need to know which one this is before you decide what to do about it." Bram stared at her. She held his gaze. She wasn't going to back down from it. Not on this. Then, before anyone could say another word, the first shot came. It came out of the dark beyond the platform edge, from the direction of the back trail. A high-caliber round. From the sound of it, she'd grown up around men who hunted, and she knew the difference. It hit the supply tent frame and blew through it. Everyone moved. Bram and Kier broke in opposite directions, using the ore packs and the burning barn wall as cover, and they were returning fire before Evie had fully registered what was happening. The Winchester reports were enormous in the cold air. Bram was already in the rock notch that had been his post all day. He shot twice, fast, controlled. More fire came back from below. At least 3 shooters. The muzzle flashes showed through the blowing snow, which had come in fast and hard in the last few minutes, the kind of snow that moved laterally on the wind and cut visibility to 20 feet. Rowan had the horses low and behind the ore packs. He was keeping them down with his body and his voice. Thurston was at the platform edge with his own rifle, returning fire on Bram's left. He was moving between positions, denying the shooters a fixed target, and he was very good at it. Then he wasn't moving. The round caught him high on the right side, above the shoulder joint, and it spun him and put him down against the rock face. He got back to one knee immediately, and she could see from 40 feet away that he was hurt badly, the whole right side of his coat going dark. Evie was moving. She got to him low, staying below the line of the ore packs, and she put her hands on him, and he let her without argument, which told her more about how much pain he was in than anything he said. "How bad?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. She got her hand up under his coat. The bullet had gone in clean high shoulder, but it was in there, not through. "You're going to be fine," she said. "I need to get you down and under cover. Can you move?" "Yes," he said. He was white around the mouth, but his eyes were clear and steady. She got her shoulder under his good arm, and they moved together, bent low along the rock face to the supply tent. Inside, it was partially protected from the wind, the sides still standing even with the frame hit. She got him down flat. She pressed his hand over the wound and told him to hold it. She heard Bram's Winchester fire 3 times in rapid succession, then a pause, then Kier's voice. From the platform edge, very loud. Carrying over the wind, they're pulling back. Pass trail, moving east. One more shot came in from a distance. Then nothing. The blizzard filled in the silence. Wind and snow and the last settling sounds of the burning barn. Bram appeared in the tent opening. He took one look at Thurston, then at Evie. His expression shifted. "How bad?" he said. The same as Thurston had. "Shoulder," she said. "Bullet's in. I need to get it out tonight. He can't go down the trail with it in, and he can't survive a night at this altitude with the wound open and untended." Bram looked at his brother. Thurston was breathing steadily, still conscious, one hand clamped to his shoulder. "What do you need?" Bram said. She was already thinking through it. She'd read medical guides. She'd read everything available in the Boston Public Library when she was 17 and going through a period of determined self-education that her mother had found alarming. She knew the theory. She was about to learn if theory was enough. "Kerosene lamp," she said. "The bone probe from the medical kit there is a medical kit," Rowan mentioned it. She looked at Rowan, who had appeared at the tent opening. He nodded and was already turning. "Pine pitch if we have it. Needle and thread from the kit. Clean cloth." Rowan went. She looked at Thurston. He was looking at her with those steady gray eyes, and his face was pale and tight with pain. But there was no panic in him. There was trust. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't earned it in any way she could point to. He was giving it anyway, the same way he'd put that latch on her door, because it was the reasonable thing to do. "Hold on," she told him. Outside, the blizzard pressed down on the mountain, and the mounted gunmen were out there somewhere in the white dark, and the only pass down was sealed in snow and firelight. But inside the tent, the lamp came on, and Rowan brought the kit, and Evie Mercer rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The lamp threw a circle of yellow light across the tent floor. Evie set everything out in order before she touched him. That was the first rule she remembered, from the surgical guides organized before you begin, because once you begin, there's no clean pause. The bone probe, thin and blunt-tipped, went to the left of the lamp. The needle, already threaded with the coarsest thread in the kit, went beside it. 2 strips of clean cloth folded into pads. The pine pitch tin, which Rowan had found in the bottom of the medical kit, set close to the lamp to warm it. The kerosene lamp itself. She turned up as high as it would go. Her hands were cold. She held them near the lamp for 30 seconds and watched them until she was satisfied they'd steadied. Outside, the blizzard was not cooperating with anyone. The wind hit the tent walls in long, surging pulses, and the temperature was still dropping. She could hear it in the way the canvas moved, that particular taut vibration that meant serious cold pressing from outside. Bram and Kier were out there in it. She didn't let herself think about that. One problem at a time. The man in front of her was the problem she could actually solve. "I need to take the coat off," she told Thurston. "I know," he said. She cut the coat sleeve rather than pull it. The blood had already saturated through to the outer layer, and the fabric was beginning to stiffen in the cold. Rowan held the lamp while she worked the material free, slow and careful, watching Thurston's face for the signals that would tell her how close he was to passing out. He was close, but he hadn't gone over yet. The wound was high on the right shoulder, outside the joint, which was the best possible location, given the alternative. The bullet had gone in clean and stayed. No exit wound. She pressed the area around it carefully, feeling for the resistance that would tell her how deep. Not deep, she'd been afraid of deep. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I'm aware," Thurston said. "I'm telling you because I need you to stay still, not because I think you'll be surprised by the pain." He almost smiled. "Understood." She heated the bone probe in the lamp flame until the tip was too hot to touch, then let it cool to warm. Sanitation worked through heat. She knew this from the Lister papers that had made it into the Boston Medical Library a few years back, the principle that invisible agents caused wound infection, and heat destroyed them. It wasn't universally accepted yet in American practice, but it made enough logical sense to her that she wasn't going to skip the step. She went in. Thurston made a sound once, just once, at the moment of initial entry, and then he locked it down and held still with a discipline that she found herself depending on in a way she hadn't expected. She felt the probe make contact with the bullet at about 1.25 inches depth, just inside the muscle layer, sitting against the underside of the scapula. "Got it," she said. "It's not deep. I can get it." She switched instruments, using the narrow forceps from the kit, and worked the bullet out in 2 steady movements. It came free, and she dropped it on the cloth and moved immediately to packing the wound with a cloth pad. Pressing firmly, Thurston's head went back against the bedroll. He was breathing through his nose, long and deliberate. "Worst part's over," she said. "Define worst," he said. "The part I couldn't predict. The stitching I can predict." She reached for the warmed pine pitch. "This will hold the wound sealed until we can get you to a proper physician in Stonewater. Pine pitch has been used as a wound sealant. Since before either of us was born, it's antibacterial, and it adheres well to tissue. This is standard frontier medicine." "You've done this before," he said. It was half a question. "No," she said completely honestly, "but I've read every account I could find." He looked at her. "That's a more reassuring answer than it should be." "I know," she said. She applied the pitch, gave it a moment to set, then began the stitching. 8 sutures, close and even. She'd practiced the stitch on leather at home in Boston, years ago, for reasons she hadn't been able to explain to her mother at the time. She was grateful for it now. When she tied off the last suture and cut the thread, Rowan let out a breath, audible even over the wind. She bandaged the shoulder tight, checked the color in Thurston's fingers. Good, the circulation was intact, and then sat back on her heels and let herself exhale for the first time in what felt like an hour. Thurston looked at the ceiling of the tent. Then he turned his head and looked at her. His right hand came up, the injured side, moving slow and careful. He found her fingers where they rested on the bedroll beside him and closed his hand around them. Her fingers were still marked with his blood, dried now, dark in the creases of her knuckles. He held on. She didn't pull away. For a moment the wind pressed against the tent, and the lamp flickered, and the blizzard was absolutely enormous outside, and there were a very small human arrangement inside it. But the smallness didn't feel helpless. It felt deliberate, like something chosen. "You taught me my life had dignity," she said quietly. She wasn't sure where it came from. It was simply the truest thing available. That first night. The latch. "I will not let you throw yours away." Thurston looked at her for a long time. "I wasn't planning to," he said. "Good," she said. She heard footsteps on the platform outside, the crunch of boots on frozen rock. Then the tent flap opened, and Bram came in sideways, out of the wind, snow on his shoulders and his coat, his face reddened from the cold, and his eyes sharp and scanning in the way they always were. He saw Thurston. He saw the bandaging. He looked at Evie. Whatever he'd been about to say, he didn't say it. He came down on one knee beside his brother instead and put his hand on Thurston's good shoulder, a brief, hard contact. And Thurston gripped his wrist once in return. That was all. It was enough. 2 dead on the trail, Bram said. Third made it into the tree line. Kier's tracking. He won't go far in this. He looked at Thurston. They'll try again before morning if they think the pass is still open. It's not, Thurston said. He pushed himself upright, slowly, and Evie started to object, and he shook his head once. I can sit up. I need to sit up. Tell me the defensive position. She let him sit up. She kept her hand on his good arm in case he needed it. He didn't pull away from that. Bram laid out the situation in plain terms. The blizzard had sealed the main pass completely. No one was coming up or going down that route until it broke, which could be hours or could be days. The back trail was the only alternative, and it was single file, defensible. Kier had taken the high position on the rock shelf above the trail access point. Anyone trying to come up in the dark would be moving toward a man who could track in a blizzard without a lantern. So we're contained, Thurston said. We're protected, Bram said. Different thing. Rowan was in the corner of the tent, his dark eyes moving between his brothers. He'd been quiet through all of it, but his quiet was active, tracking everything, missing nothing. He'd kept the lamp steady through the surgery without being asked to, had anticipated each thing Evie needed a half second before she reached for it. She said, Rowan. He looked at her. You did well tonight, she said. He blinked. Then he nodded once and looked at his hands. Thurston managed 6 hours of sleep, broken and shallow, with Evie checking his pulse and the wound's heat every hour. Bram dozed in 20-minute intervals, rifle across his lap, coming fully awake at the slightest change in the sound of the wind. By the time a gray, grudging light started showing through the tent canvas, the blizzard had dropped from a roar to a sustained, hostile mutter. Still bad, but passable. Kier came in from the cold at first light, with frost in his beard and his rifle slung. He sat down, accepted the tin cup of water Rowan handed him, and drank it. Trail's clear, he said. He didn't come back. Then he looked at Thurston, checked the bandaging with his eyes. Looked at Evie. He said nothing. But the look said everything it needed to. They packed what remained in the camp and began the descent as soon as the light was strong enough to trust the trail. Evie rode close to Thurston the whole way down. 3 days after they came down from Granite Ridge, the cabin was quiet in the way that only came after something had been survived. Thurston was at the table, his shoulder in a proper sling. Now Evie had rigged one from a flour sack with the survey maps in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He could move his fingers on the injured side, which she checked each morning by having him grip her hand. His grip was getting stronger every day. She was monitoring it for infection with the particular focused attention of someone who has decided that a thing is not going to go wrong on her watch. His temperature had spiked on the second night, and she'd spent 4 hours keeping cold cloths on his forehead and making him drink water, and telling him in a low, calm voice that this was the body's expected response to trauma, and it was going to pass. It passed. Now he was steady, and the wound was closing clean, and she could breathe again. She was sitting with Jethro's journal. She'd read it through twice already, but she was going through it a third time, more slowly, focused on the final entries. Something in them had been sitting wrong in her mind since the mountain, a detail she'd noticed, but not fully resolved. Rowan was at the far end of the table with his books. He'd glanced at the journal once when she picked it up, but hadn't asked questions. He waited for her to find what she was looking for, which she appreciated. She found it on the third pass. The entry was dated October 23rd, 6 days before the last one. Drake's man proposed a private arrangement tonight at the Stonewater Card House. Said if I signed a quitclaim on the north face only, he'd forgive the note and leave the rest of the property clean. I sat in the game to hear him out. I had no intention of signing. I let him believe I was considering it. If he thinks I'm wavering, he'll show me more of his hand. She went to the next entry, October 25th. He showed me more of his hand. There's a second note. Not against this property, against the Morrison claim on the South Ridge. Same fraudulent instrument, same impossible interest schedule. Morrison doesn't have anyone who can read contract law. He'll lose everything inside a month unless someone stops this at the source. Then October 27th, one day before the last entry, I went back to the card house and refused. Told Drake's man the note was fraudulent and I'd be taking it to the territorial marshal in Lander. He laughed. He told me accidents happen on mining claims all the time. I came home and wrote everything down. I'm putting this journal under the floor in the morning before I go back up the cut. If something happens to me, I want my brothers to have the paper. She read that entry twice. Then she sat still. Then she understood. Rowan, she said. He looked up. Jethro knew, she said. He knew they were going to try to kill him. He went up to the cut anyway because he needed the documented evidence of the beam damage, the physical proof. He didn't run. He walked back into it because he understood that without the evidence, Drake would just do the same thing to the Morrison claim and every other independent operation on this range. Rowan was very still across the table. He chose it, she said carefully. He didn't surrender, and he didn't betray anyone. He went back up there to get what was needed, knowing what the risk was. The cabin was quiet for a moment. The buckle, Rowan said. Stolen from his body, she said. Drake's men took it after the collapse. They kept it to use later, exactly the way they used it on the mountain to plant doubt, to make the brothers wonder whether Jethro had cooperated with Drake, to fracture the family from the inside. She put the journal down. He died protecting this land and every independent claim on this range, she said. And they've been using his memory as a weapon against the people he was trying to protect. Rowan looked at the journal for a long time. His jaw was set. Then he stood up and went to get Bram. Bram came in from the yard where he'd been sharpening fence posts with a hatchet, still holding the tool. He read the entries she'd marked. He read them standing at the table, not sitting, and he read them twice. And when he looked up, his face was doing several things at once, none of them simple. He went back up, Bram said. For the evidence, Evie said. For the record of what Drake had done to the beam structure. Because without the physical documentation, the journal alone isn't enough. Bram set the hatchet down on the table. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he said, I was going to ride to Stonewater and kill Malachi Drake. Nobody responded to that immediately. I know, Evie said. I had it decided, Bram said. He wasn't being defensive, he was being precise. After the mountain. After we found the buckle and they shot Thurston, I had it decided. I know, she said again. He looked at her. And Jethro spent his last week on Earth choosing the law over the blood response, she said, steady and direct. He sat in that card game and played along and stayed patient and came back down and wrote every detail down so there would be a record. He trusted that the record would matter. He trusted that someone would use it. She held Bram's gaze. Are you going to tell me that trust was misplaced? That you're going to throw away everything he built toward because Drake made you angry enough to want to be the one who ends this personally? Bram's eyes were dark and very direct, and there was a storm behind them. But he was listening. She could see him listening. Drake wants you angry, she said. An angry man riding into Stonewater with a gun is a problem that solves itself for Drake. He'll have you in chains or in the ground before nightfall, and everything Jethro documented goes with you. Silence. Bram picked the hatchet back up. He turned it over in his hand once. Then he set it back down deliberately and stepped away from the table. What's the plan? He said. It was flat and controlled and not happy about any of this, but it was the question she'd needed him to ask. She'd been thinking about the plan for 3 days. Rowan and Keir take the ore and the documentation to the territorial marshal in Lander, she said. The journal, the demand note with my legal analysis attached, the ore assay as proof of the property's value, and the sawed timber specimens from the high cut if we can get them. She looked at Rowan. You're the one who can explain the journal's chain of evidence. Keir goes because nobody on that trail is going to attempt to rob a man his size carrying a Winchester. Keir, who had appeared in the doorway at some point without announcement, said nothing. But he moved one step into the room, which she interpreted as assent. While they're in Lander, she continued, we wait for Drake's next move. He'll make one. He doesn't have the temperament not to. He'll push on the public auction angle because it's his deadline, not ours. He's been telling the territory that this property is forfeit, and if he doesn't produce the land, he loses credibility with every other creditor and every other claim holder he's been running this scheme against. She turned to Bram, which means he'll force a public action in Stonewater within the next week. And when he does, we'll be there. With what? Bram said. With everything Jethro gave us, she said. Bram looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled, a long, deliberate breath that took a lot of things out of it on the way. All right, he said. Thurston, from the table where he'd been listening without interrupting, said Rowan. Keir, how soon can you move? Rowan was already calculating. Tomorrow at first light. We can be in Lander in 2 days if the lower pass is open. Take the Morrison note details, too, Evie said. The October 25th journal entry documents that Drake was running the same fraud against at least one other claim. The marshal will want the full scope. Rowan wrote that down. That night, the cabin felt different. Still close and cold and frontier raw around all its edges. But there was something resolved in the air. Now, a decision made and accepted and no longer being fought against. After supper, Bram went outside and stood by the fence line for a while in the dark. Evie could see him from the window, just his outline against the snow, the ember of a cigarette moving at intervals. She didn't go out to him. He didn't need company. He needed the cold and the space and the specific silence of a man working through an enormous grief that had just been reorganized from fury into something more bearable. She watched the window until the cigarette went dark, and he came back inside. He came through the main room and stopped at the edge of the light from the fire. He was a better man than I gave him credit for being, Bram said. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It didn't need to be. Most people are, Evie said. Bram looked at the fire. Then he went to bed. She sat up, alone for another hour, going over the plan in her mind, checking it for gaps. Outside, Wyoming was dark and enormous and cold, and somewhere in the town of Stonewater, Malachi Drake was making his own calculations. She intended to be ready for them. Stonewater on a Thursday morning was not much to look at. Main Street was 2 blocks of false-fronted timber buildings, a mercantile, a land office, a saloon with a broken shutter, and a courthouse that had been built with ambition and maintained with indifference. The street itself was frozen mud, rutted deep from wagon traffic, and glazed over with a thin skin of ice that caught the winter light and threw it back flat and cold. By 10 in the morning, there were maybe 60 people gathered on the steps of the Stonewater Mercantile. Drake had announced the auction 3 days prior, posting notices at the land office and the assay house and the saloon, because that was where men with claims gathered, and he wanted witnesses to the legal transfer. He wanted it public. He wanted it visible. A public auction of a forfeited property was the territory's way of making dispossession look orderly, and Malachi Drake understood better than most how much damage could be done to a man's livelihood while everyone stood around watching it happen in an organized fashion. Evie stood at the back of the crowd with Thurston on her left and Bram on her right. Thurston's right arm was still in the sling, but he was standing straight, and his color was good and his eyes were clear. He'd wanted to be here. She hadn't tried to stop him. Bram had said exactly 4 words that morning. Let's finish this today. He'd said it while loading his Winchester, and the way he'd said it was perfectly calm, which Evie had learned was more concerning than when he was visibly agitated. She had the documents in a leather satchel under her left arm. Drake was on the mercantile steps. She'd seen him once before, briefly, at a distance, when he'd ridden past the cabin with his enforcers during the 20-day demand period. Up close, he was older than she'd expected, with a broad, pale face and the particular groomed quality of a man who spent money on his appearance because he understood that appearance communicated authority. His coat was excellent. His boots were excellent. He held himself like a man who had never once in his adult life been told no and had it stick. He was mid-sentence when Evie walked through the crowd. She didn't push or rush. She simply moved forward with the steady, measured pace of someone who had somewhere specific to be, and arrived there, the center of the cleared space in front of the steps, and stopped. Drake stopped talking. The crowd shifted. 60 people, turning to look at a woman in a dark wool coat, standing in the middle of their street with a leather satchel, and no apparent concern for what Malachi Drake thought about her presence. "Miss Mercer." Drake's voice was smooth and entirely controlled. "This is a public proceeding. I'd ask you to." "It is a public proceeding," she said, clearly, loud enough for the back of the crowd, which means the public should hear all the relevant facts before a property transfer is recorded. She opened the satchel. The demand note served against the Vanasek homestead cites a mortgage instrument dated March 1879. She held the document up. "That instrument does not exist. There is no signed copy in territorial records, no copy in the Vanasek property file, and no notarized original because no mortgage was ever executed. The note is fraudulent on its face." Murmuring from the crowd. "Furthermore," she said, pulling the second document, "the interest schedule in the note compounds weekly at 12%, which comes to over 500% annually. Wyoming Territorial Lending Statute caps legal interest at 15% per year. This note has no legal standing." Drake was very still on the steps. She reached into the satchel again and produced the journal, wrapped in its oilcloth, and beside it, a folded document she'd spent 2 nights preparing a written summary of Jethro's evidence, dated and signed, with the timber specimen descriptions attached. Jethro Vanasek documented, in writing and in dated entries, that the support beams of the high-cut mine were intentionally compromised prior to the collapse that killed him. He named Malachi Drake as the individual who ordered it. He was killed because he went back to gather physical evidence. His personal effects were subsequently stolen from his body and used as planted evidence to mislead his family. She looked up at the crowd. "The Morrison claim on the South Ridge has been served with an identical fraudulent instrument, as has, I understand, the Phelps operation near Dubois." The murmuring got louder. A man near the front, she didn't know him, older, with the hands of a working miner, said, "I got one of those notes, too." Another voice, from the left side of the crowd, "So did we." Drake moved. He came down 2 steps, and his hand went inside his coat, and he had the revolver out and leveled before most of the crowd understood what was happening. He pointed it at Evie. "This proceeding," he said, very quietly, "is concluded." The crowd went completely still. Evie did not move. She did not step back. She looked at the revolver, and she looked at Drake's face, and she made a decision in about 1 second that she was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her retreat. The shot came from above, not at her. The revolver spun out of Drake's hand and clattered down the mercantile steps. And Drake grabbed his hand and made a sound. And from the roof of the livery stable across the street, Bram Vanacek lowered his Winchester with the particular unhurried quality of a man who had been confident about the outcome. For 1 second, nothing moved. Then Keir came from the left side of the crowd with 2 U.S. Marshals behind him, both with badges visible and hands on their sidearms, and Drake's remaining enforcers, 3 of them, positioned at the edge of the crowd, looked at Keir's size and the Marshals' badges and made sensible decisions about their futures. Drake was in irons before he finished processing what had happened to him. The senior marshal, a compact man with gray in his mustache, looked at Evie's documents for approximately 4 minutes. He looked at the territorial injunction that Rowan had obtained in Lander, which bore the marshal's official seal. He looked at Drake. "Malachi Drake," he said. "You are under federal arrest for the crimes of extortion, fraud, and murder in the first degree in the matter of Jethro Vanacek, deceased." Drake said nothing. His excellent coat was torn at the collar, where Keir had helped the marshals take hold of him, and without the authority he'd been arranging around himself like furniture, he looked considerably smaller than he had on those steps. Evie put the documents back in the satchel. Thurston appeared at her shoulder. He'd moved through the crowd without her noticing. He looked at Drake being walked to the marshal's horse, then at her. "The homestead and mining patent," he said. "Declared sovereign and debt-free," she said. "The injunction covers it. The marshal's office will file the restoration of title by end of week." Thurston was quiet for a moment. Then he said Jethro would have liked to see that. "I know," she said. "I think he did see it, in whatever way that's possible." Thurston looked at the sky for a moment, clear today, sharp and cold and very blue over the roof lines of Stonewater. Then he offered her his good arm. She took it, and they walked back toward the horses together. Deep winter came down over Wind River Range, like a held breath finally released. The outside world reduced itself to silence. No riders came up the trail. No more notes arrived. The mountain absorbed the weeks into itself, and what was left inside the cabin was warmth, firelight, and the specific peace of people who have been through something together and come out the other side. The stone fireplace ran all day and all night now, and the main room glowed with it, the light moving warm and amber across the pine walls and the plank floor. Rowan had hung a beaver pelt over the worst draft gap above the east window, and Keir had built a second shelf into the main room and stacked it with the firewood he split each morning. So the cabin smelled permanently of fresh-cut pine and wood smoke. They ate well. They slept. Thurston's shoulder healed. On the 14th evening after Stonewater, Evie came in from her room and found all 4 of them in the main room, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that they were all sitting down and not doing anything in particular, just there, waiting in a way that was clearly intentional. On the table was a small leather pouch. Thurston said, "Sit down, Evie." She sat. He pushed the pouch across the table to her. She opened it. Gold dust, refined. The portion of the ore yield that had not gone to the debt discharge. She knew the rough value. She'd run the numbers herself. It was enough to live on for 2 years in a city, enough to open a small business, enough to go home to Boston and rebuild whatever she chose to rebuild entirely on her own terms, beholden to no one. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at the 4 of them. Thurston's gray eyes were steady. Rowan watched her with the careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. Keir sat with his hands on his knees, solid and still and present. Bram was leaning back with his arms crossed. But his jaw wasn't set the way it used to be, and his eyes on her were something she'd learned to read differently over the past weeks. "You are free," Thurston said. "Wealthy. Independent. You can return east as your own woman, with no obligation to anyone here." He paused. "Whatever you choose, we will ensure you get there safely." She looked at the pouch. She thought about Boston. She thought about what it had been and what it would be when she returned a city that had decided she was a problem and arranged itself accordingly. She thought about cold marble floors and drawing rooms where women sat decoratively and weren't heard. She thought about the train platform in Cheyenne, where she'd transferred coaches in the dark, alone, carrying her single trunk 2,000 miles from anything familiar, and how she hadn't cried then either. Then she thought about a flour sack sling on a healing shoulder, a pine spoon carved at altitude, a beaver pelt over a drafty window, botanical books and Whitman, and the ring of a hammer on iron in the cold. a hand gripping hers in a lantern-lit tent while the blizzard pressed down on the mountain. She looked up. She looked at each of them, one at a time, taking her time with it, and what she saw looking back at her was not charity, not obligation, not the careful management of a problem. It was 4 men who had learned what she was made of and wanted her there. She closed the pouch. "I'm staying," she said. She held Thurston's gaze first. "I'm claiming all 4 of you. As my home, as my family." She put the pouch down on the table. "That's my choice. I'm making it clearly, and I'm making it freely. And I'm not making it because I have nowhere else to go." Nobody said anything for a moment. Bram uncrossed his arms. Thurston stood and came around the table. He stopped in front of her and looked down at her with those steady, serious eyes. And then he took her face very gently in his good hand and kissed her forehead with a reverence so deliberate it seemed to rearrange something in the room. "Then you're home?" he said. Rowan Wisby's hands were in her hair, and he said her name quietly. Once, against her temple, like a word he'd been turning over for weeks and was finally certain how to use. Keir simply put his arms around her from behind, enormous and warm and utterly certain, and she felt surrounded in a way she'd never felt in her life, not trapped, nothing like trapped, grounded, held. Bram came last. He stood in front of her and looked at her for a long moment, with those dark, direct eyes that had spent weeks being suspicious of her and had arrived somewhere completely different. "I'm not easy," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't want easy." He pulled her in. The fireplace crackled and sent its warmth across the room in long, amber waves, and outside the snow pressed down on Wind River Range. And inside the cabin, the 5 of them were the truest definition of a chosen family, not bloodlines and not legal documents, but 4 people who had decided one woman was worth building toward, and one woman who had decided 4 people were worth staying for. Thurston's hands were careful with the pearl buttons at her collar, deliberate, asking in their slowness. Rowan's voice was low near her ear, describing what he saw in her, the way he described the things he loved precisely and without hesitation. Keir's touch was what it always was, steady and massive and patient, service expressed through attention. Bram held nothing back. His hands were in her hair, and his mouth was at her throat, and the particular fierceness he'd been redirecting for months found its proper purpose at last, and it was nothing like dangerous, and everything like honest. Overwhelmed by all of it, the warmth and the firelight, and the sheer solid reality of being completely and genuinely wanted by people who knew exactly who she was. Evie arched back into the buffalo robes, gripped the pelts in both hands, and cried out in pure, trembling ecstasy. "Oh God, it's so hard." The words came from both places at once, and she knew it. The breathtaking physical reality of them surrounding her, and the emotional magnitude of finally letting her armor down completely after 22 years of holding it in place through sheer determined will. Both true, both real, both finally allowed. The fire burned long and warm. The mountain held them in its winter silence, and Evie Mercer, who had crossed 2,000 miles for a life worth living, found it exactly where she'd refused to stop looking. Spring came slowly, and then all at once. The first sign was the creek. It went from silence to sound over the course of 3 days in late March, first a trickle under the ice, then the ice breaking up in the afternoon sun, then the full voice of meltwater coming down off the granite above, clean and cold and continuous. Evie heard it change and stood on the porch in the early morning with her coffee and listened to it for a long time. Then the columbines came up, alpine blue, scattered at first along the south-facing bank, where the snow retreated earliest, and then spreading out across the meadow below the cabin, in patches, and then in swaths, until by the end of April, the whole lower field was covered in them, moving in the wind like something that had been waiting a long time for the right conditions. The cabin was not the same cabin it had been in November. Keir had spent the winter building. A second wing off the east wall, properly framed and chinked, with 2 additional rooms and a wide covered porch that looked out over the meadow and the creek. A stone root cellar sunk into the hillside, behind the main structure, properly ventilated, with shelving he'd built from milled pine. A forge, separate from the main buildings, with a bellows he'd salvaged from the closed mining operation at Granite Ridge and rebuilt entirely by hand. The forge was open to any family in the valley who needed ironwork done. That had been Kier's only stated condition when Thurston had asked him what he wanted to do with the spring. He'd said, "I want the forge open." And then he'd gone back to building it. Within 3 weeks, there was a handmade sign above the door, the letters punched into a strip of iron, "Vanisek Forge All Welcome." Rowan's schoolhouse went up in April. Thurston had surveyed the site with him in February, working at the table with graph paper and a ruler, while the snow came down outside. They'd picked a flat piece of ground a quarter-mile from the cabin, close enough to the trail that families from the valley could reach it easily. Bram and Kier had gone up and cleared it in 3 days. A local carpenter from Stonewater came out with his crew and framed it up in another 4. On the first day of May, Rowan stood in front of 11 children and 2 adults who hadn't had much schooling and opened a lesson on basic geography. He'd written on the chalkboard. The chalkboard Evie had helped him source from a supply house in Lander, paid for, with a portion of the gold dust, the first principle he intended to teach. The purpose of knowledge is to make the world navigable for everyone, not just the few who already know where they're going. He taught it verbally, too, because some of his students couldn't yet read it. That was fine. That was what he was there for. Bram led the first mountain expedition in late April. Not a mining operation, a trade route. He'd spent the winter mapping the high passes and identifying which families were isolated enough that resupply was genuinely dangerous. And in the spring, he organized a regular pack train that ran provisions and tools to the upper valley settlements at fair rates. No gouging, no predatory credit. Word spread. By the second trip, 3 other families had asked to join the operation and share both the work and the returns. He was not a natural administrator. He was a natural leader, which was different, and the distinction mattered. Thurston's shoulder healed fully by February. The scar remained, as scars do, a permanent record of a specific night and a specific choice. He didn't seem to mind it. Evie had caught him looking at it once in the small mirror above the wash basin, and his expression was not one of a man who resented what he saw. The ranch and the cooperative mine ran under Thurston and Evie's joint management, which had been a natural development rather than a decided one. She kept the ledgers. He made the operational decisions. They disagreed regularly and productively, and both of them were better at their jobs for it. The Morrison claim had been stabilized over the winter, and 2 other independent operations that Drake had been targeting were now part of the cooperative, pooling their processing yields and sharing the sluice equipment. The arrangement had no formal name. Everyone just called it the Ridge Agreement, because that was where the idea had started. Malachi Drake was in federal custody in Cheyenne, awaiting trial on charges that had expanded considerably as other claim holders came forward. Evie had provided a written deposition in March, precise and fully documented. She'd been told it was one of the clearest legal submissions the Territorial Marshal's Office had received from a private citizen. She'd noted that private citizens would produce clearer submissions if they were educated, and that perhaps the territory should consider making education less of an accident. The marshal had looked at her and written something down. On a morning in late May, Evie stood in the meadow below the cabin, with the columbines moving around her ankles and the creek loud to the east and the mountains above her still holding their snowpack, white and absolute, against a sky that had finally decided to be genuinely blue. Thurston came and stood beside her. They were quiet for a while. This was comfortable now, the shared silence. It had taken a winter to build, and she valued it, the way she valued the latch on her door as evidence that some things were real. Rowan had 8 students show up today, she said. He told me, Thurston said. He's already talking about a second room. He'll need it by fall, she said. Thurston looked at the mountains. Jethro would have liked the schoolhouse, he said. He would have liked all of it, she said. He built toward this. He just didn't get to see it. Thurston nodded once. She thought about the journal under the floorboards, now sitting openly on Rowan's shelf where anyone who visited could see it. She'd suggested that. A record of what one person's choice had made possible deserved to be visible, not hidden. A figure appeared on the porch, Rowan, calling something across the meadow about supper. Kier's hammer rang from the direction of the forge, steady and rhythmic. From somewhere, up the trail came Bram's whistle, the particular three-note signal he used when he was coming in from the ridge and wanted the gate open. Evie looked at all of it. The fiercest mountain winter must always yield to a love forged in honesty, mutual respect, and unyielding courage. She hadn't said those words. She didn't need to. They were simply true, and the meadow and the creek and the schoolhouse and the forge and the 5 people who had chosen each other through the hardest winter the Wind River Range had thrown at them, all of it was the proof. She turned back toward the cabin. The columbines moved in the wind behind her, bright and blue, and entirely unbothered by winter. Spring had arrived. This story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. All characters and events depicted are products of imagination and bear no resemblance to real persons or occurrences.